and then we can have a sort of little chat, socially.
Without the other person knowing that you were going to be there.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, but on the other hand, he does know that I'm a journalist, and but when you're there around the table, it's not an interview; it's a social. And the corollary of that, so there were lots of permutations of that kind of thing, like sort of meeting people socially and going to dinners and getting other people to connect us in a social way. So there's and that was very good for all kinds of gossip and tidbits and so on. However, there's a major problem with that journalistically. And that is, as you're probably aware, I mean, when you're, in order to quote someone on the record, you have to identify yourself as a journalist. You have to ask them for their permission that, that their comments are on the record. If you're just talking to somebody in a social situation, then, that's essentially pretty much by definition, non-attributable. People don't really know the difference between, background and off the record and so on. But regardless of all of those sort of journalistic niceties, the upshot of it is that there's far more anonymous sources than I would really like, and that I'm comfortable with. And unfortunately, I mean, we the reader's just going to have to live with that.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
mean,
No way
you
around
could
it.
say I just made all those people up. I mean, well, as it happens, I didn't. But it's always an uncomfortable thing to have to ask the readers to trust you on anything. And American newspapers and magazines, I worked for the American press for most of my career, 25 years at Newsweek, and they are American newspapers and magazines are justifiably very nervous about anonymous sources, because not really for the reason because that they think the journalists make them up. That I don't think that very rarely happens, that journalists just invent stuff. The major problem with anonymous sources is when someone is not answering for their own words, then it's much easier for them to mislead you. That's really the reason why it's a difficult thing to anonymize sources. Anyway, but the atmosphere in Moscow was very strange. It was one of nervousness about whether mass repression was going to begin, because actually it didn't really begin. There was no immediate mass repression inside Russia in the first weeks of the war. But there were, everyone was extremely nervous about things, extraordinary things that might happen. The war, already an extraordinary thing, happened. Could another extraordinary thing like a general mobilization happen? Well, possibly. Could the closing the borders happen? Well, possibly. So in that kind of suddenly this, as the Russians say, the war sort of broke like a thunderbolt over a sort of otherwise a sort of unsuspecting bourgeois life of Moscow.
Yeah, well, before we dive into some of the content in your book, just a bit about your background, because not only professionally did you work and cover Russia, but you actually have family connections in Russia.